The terminology for the area today is that people call it the Cathedral Quarter. Now, for anybody who lived in the area, that name's a nonsense. You know, it's not called the Cathedral Quarter, it's called the Half Bop. It's as simple as that. And for the generations of people who lived here, it was the Half Bop and always will be the Half Bop. It was never the Cathedral Quarter. The Cathedral Quarter is just this name that was thought up by these developers. And, you know, they're trying to change the history and the image of the place by saying that it was the heart of commerce and stuff like this. Well, unless you call prostitution commerce, I don't think so. You know, and, you know, what we're always trying to point out to them, you can change the future, you can't change the past. So if you're doing a history, you have to do this history, warts and all. Now, there's a lot of buildings in the area. You know, there's the cathedral and stuff like that. And there's other people who do tours of buildings. We're not one of them. We have no interest whatsoever in buildings. Because if you're presenting a community history of an area, it's the people who make up an area. Buildings are only bricks and mortar piled on top of each other. It's the people who lived within them that really matter. And there are stories that we're going to tell tonight. And some of them are pretty horrific. But I mean, I'll give you a whole explanation of what life was like in these so-called good old days. And let's put it this way, they weren't so good. Now, the best thing to do is to start off with the name. You know, the Half Bop, where did this name come from? Now, nobody really knows for a fact where it came from. And everybody has a different theory. Our theory is quite simple. We've all heard of Barney Hughes's Bakery. And Barney Hughes's Bakery was very, very well known for the Belfast Bop, the Barney Hughes Bop. And although it was later established up in West Belfast on the Springfield Road, Barney Hughes's Bakery actually started at that corner over there. It started off just at this corner where the hairdressers are. And we feel it's a coincidence that here we had this bakery and the most famous product being a bop, and directly beside it, this area called the Half Bop. You know, so there's that coincidence. You know, there's other people who theorize that it was called after a roundabout in the area. Now, putting aside exactly where this roundabout was, roundabouts are an invention of the 1950s. It was well known as the Half Bop long before that. Now, what we're going to do in the tours, we're going to go around different spots and look at different aspects of the history. From this spot here, one aspect was Barney Hughes's Bakery. Another one was Thomas Gallagher's. There's a lot of people, well, I know one, who worked in Gallagher's factory on York Street. Gallagher's factory also started here, and it started at the corner where the Belfast Telegraph is. And what he done was he got a loan from the Fenian movement to start up a tobacco factory. You know, so how it came to be one of the most prominent Protestant places, I don't know. But another thing too also about it is, most of us will know about the BRA. It's a well-known grammar school. But the BRA actually started off in this corner, the corner we're starting now. But what's so unique about the BRA is it's the only school locally that ever had an armed rebellion. And the armed rebellion was as a result of something quite simple. They weren't allowed out on their Easter holidays. And so what the pupils done was they grabbed the muskets from the guard room. Now, what a school was doing with the guard room, but they grabbed the muskets and they held a siege in the school at this very corner. And what happened was the Reverend William Bruce, who was the principal of it, he negotiated with them and held a promise with them that if they gave up, that they wouldn't be touched. Let's put it this way, he lied. And what he done was, as soon as they all surrendered, he got them all into the common room and whipped every single one of them. You know, and that happened right here. It occurred on the 12th of April, 1872. And, you know, it's whenever we hear about stuff like that, that's the stuff that's all forgotten about. But the good thing is about the BRA, in their history, they admit it. And they're actually proud of the fact that it happened. But another one, just while we're at this corner, you know, this corner here was Belfast's first post office. And it started off just here. And the post office then was quite different to what the post office is today, because there was no checks or nothing like that. So if you needed to send money, it was sent through the post. And once a week, the coach came from Dublin and pulled up here, and it had to be an armed coach because of highway robbery. And highway robbery didn't happen, you know, on the country roads or the Dick Turpin thing. They happened as soon as they got here. And later on, we'll explain a couple of locals who give it a bash and what happened to them. You need to compare old maps and old records to find out exactly what was here. But the unfortunate thing about the city today is we see these plaques going up all around and they're giving this glamorous history. There was nothing glamorous about our history. Now, you can see there's a lot of modern buildings around. And what we'll do is we're going to move to a spot just on down and we'll explain. First of all, a grisly part of our history, and then we'll explain why there's so many modern buildings around this part. Right, but one of the other things about the area, and it's unique in Belfast because it never seemed to happen anywhere else, is that the old Belfast Corporation, they had this idea that if you had a notorious slum, the reason you got rid of it was to change its name. And that happened in one of the most notorious areas in Belfast was an area called Hudson's Entry, which was today's Gresham Street. And that area was so bad, it was beyond belief. What was known as the Bulkies, which later became the Pillars, and the whole area was actually known as the Smithfield Republic because they wouldn't go in. It was that bad. And it's actually interesting when you see the advertisements for Castle Court and the glamorised their site. On the site stood Belfast Castle and stuff like that. Don't think so. But another area which had done it too was here. And from a street sign we can see Exchange Street West. The original name of it was Robert Street, and Robert Street had a notorious reputation for houses of ill repute. There's no other way of putting it. But they weren't brothels as such, and the whole area was made up. And what they'd done was they got drunken sailors, brought them back to the house and robbed them. And Robert Street also, we had the Belfast prison just up a road on the Crumlin Road, and one of the executions that took place there was of a man from Robert Street. A house in Robert Street, which was situated directly behind St Don's Cathedral, was the scene of a brutal murder of a poor defenceless woman by the name of Mary Ann Phillips. When police arrived at the scene, they found a woman's dead body lying inside the house. She had been badly beaten. The head and face were covered with blood from 8 different wounds, varying from 2 inches to half an inch in length, some of which penetrated to the bone. The police quickly ascertained what had happened with the help of the main witness, an unfortunate young boy of only 7 years. He pointed the guilty finger at his father, Arthur McCune, a married man who was separated and lived at the time at 38 Robert Street with Mary Ann Phillips as husband and wife. Constable Jack Douglas then went to describe the scene before him as he entered the house. In the back of the room off the kitchen, the body of the murdered woman had been lying between the bed and a chest of drawers parallel to the bed, with the head resting on a pillow which was soaked in blood. While Constable Douglas was examining the scene, the accused entered the room and made the following extraordinary statement which the constables took note of at the time. "You need not be uneasy about her. She has often been this way before." So needless to say, Monday the 14th of January at 8 o'clock, he was hanged for the murder. So that's just one case of Robert Street. And once again, it's whenever we look today and we go Exchange Street West, it's the hidden history which they've tried to keep. And what it is, this isn't the only street. We'll be looking at more streets in the area where they did change the names. And they all changed the names for exactly the same reason, because the area was so notorious. So anybody from the area, sorry. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, you can see a lot of the area is all these modern buildings. You have the art college, and you have these modern office blocks built in the 50s and 60s. The only building old enough really is this one, because we can see just beyond it all the modern sort of 60s and 50s buildings. And I'm sure I don't need to explain to a lot of you what happened to the old ones. And what that was Belfast's first development. Now, a lot of people think development, it must have been they were just pulled down. They were blown down, the Germans. And what happened was this area was pretty heavily bombed during the Blitz. And, you know, in Belfast there was no defences because people believed that the German planes couldn't reach Belfast, which has a bit of logic to it because if they were flying from Germany, they wouldn't have reached. But nobody underestimated them. They took over France, and that there then changed things. And still there was no defences. So what happened was in April, Easter 1941, the 200 German planes left Britain in the north of France, and there were two cities, Belfast and Liverpool. And the way they done it was they just flew to Belfast first, bombed it, and on the way back bombed Liverpool. And this one night in Belfast, it was the heaviest German, outside of London, was the heaviest single German blitz, because they knew they didn't really want to come back. They wanted to do the job right, but they did come back. And there's a lot of myths about the Blitz, and I don't want to sound pro-German here, but as I say, we'll have to face up to the facts. And what they done was they came and they gave Belfast a thrashing. And they came from sort of this way, and their targets were in North Belfast. And the main targets that were after was the Victoria Barracks, the Mills, York Street Mill, the Gallagher's factory, and the waterworks on the Antrim Road. Now, there's a lot of people, even today we still hear this story. The German planes thought the waterworks was the docks and bombed it. Now you try to imagine you're in a German plane, way up there. You're going to be even lucky seeing the waterworks, never mind confusing it for the docks. But what the Germans were doing was simple. The waterworks supplied most of the city with their water. They wiped out the water supply and returned. And on their return, they dropped 7 tons of incendiary bombs. Belfast was to burn, and there was no water to put it out. Now, it was clever thinking, it was a clever ploy. The only thing was it was just so tragic. But if a lot of us look at the way that they came in, you know, they came this way, and if we can see High Street and Bridge Street was levelled, then just as they were coming up, that is when they bombed. They done their carpet bombing. But another myth was that, you know, people distinctively said they heard the Stuka. The Stuka was a German Dave bomber, which made a distinctive whining noise. Now, the Stukas were for Pacific targets, and the bottom line is they didn't use Stukas, because why come to Belfast and bomb one building, but you can just send in the bombers and just level everything, you know? And that's what they've done. That's precisely what they've done, and that's what happened to a lot of this area. But the unfortunate thing, particularly with young people, is they look, excuse me, and they see all these modern buildings, and they don't realise that those modern buildings were to replace the ones that were destroyed during the Blitz. And, you know, today we can't imagine how horrific it must have been. The only good thing now is that, you know, all the truth is coming out about what really happened. You know, there's, I think on our website we'll have it, it shows you the German documents, you know, and all the stuff's coming out about Victoria Barracks. Victoria Barracks, believe it or not, up until 2 years ago, they denied that it was even hit. Whereas if you go to the Imperial War Museum or our website, you'll see all the photographs, and they just levelled it. But the whole thing was propaganda. They had to keep the morale of the people up. But unfortunately for the people of the Half Bop and the areas like it, there was no morale about it. Their areas were lying in ruins, you know. So what we're going to do now, folks, is just go over to the last houses that are remaining in the area. So we're round the corner and just down a wee bit. Right, what we'll have here is just 3 of the remaining houses off the area. And what these are is these are your typical Victorian kitchen houses. Now, basically what they were, as many people remember, 2 up, 2 down. But whenever these were built, most of these were built in the 1880s and 1890s, and whenever these were built, they were deemed as luxury. So it gives you an idea of what people were living in before that. And what they were living in was houses half this size, with say 3 rooms, or apartments as they were known then. And on each apartment you had up to 2 families living. Not 2 people, 2 families. So if you'd have had a house like this in the 1860s and 1870s, there would have been up to 60 people living in one of them. You know, that's how horrific it was. And the reason was simple. People were just too poor to be able to rent out a whole house. But as I say, when these houses were built, they were luxury. And even when they were built, there was still a lot of people lived in them. Quite often the houses were split, you know, the 2 up, 2 down, family upstairs and family downstairs. And because the families had 2 rooms, they thought it was great. You know, they thought it was fantastic, but it wasn't. And for a lot of people who remember living in them in the 60s, 50s and 60s, even the 40s, you know, they had running water, they had an outside toilet, but they weren't built to have running water and an outside toilet. That was all added in later. And even the gas for cooking, that was all added in later. So when these houses were built, they were just shells. That's all they were. Just nothing going on, no services going into them whatsoever. And yet people still deemed them as luxury. And as I was saying, if that's luxury, try and imagine what it was like just before it. But we'll be talking about it later anyway, whenever we get down to a more notorious spot. But just before we move on, they put this plaque up, and as you can read, this plaque is dedicated to the people who lived in the area known as the Half Bop. Now that's the people who lived here who put that up, and as you can see, the Half Bop, it's not the Cathedral quarter. Right, so we're just going to go on down beyond the wee car park hut, just to the next corner, folks. This is another street here which had its name changed. It was known, today it's known as Talbot Street, but its original name was Grattan Street. And you know, the area here was notorious. But at the corner here we had McKenna's pub. And as explained earlier on about the, you know, the houses of ill repute, this is one of the public houses of ill repute. And there are countless cases of where the prostitutes had brought people here, got them ailed up and robbed them, but didn't take them out to rob them in here. You know, so it's, you know, we have this old image of old Victorian pubs being, you know, everybody in, marry and drink and all this. They were Daves, that's the only way to explain them. But one was here, and the wee booklet that explains a very interesting local story, you know, there's a wee ghost story connected with it, where McKenna got married. And he went and on his honeymoon, I think he went to sunny Portrush or somewhere like that. But whenever they were staying in the hotel, both of them were gassed. And the interesting story is that they were seen in it. You know, and this story continued on for decades and never changed. You know, it was never rattly chains or heads hanging under the arms. You know, it always stayed the same, where people just seen them, nothing else. But another thing about this spot is that if you look at the opposite corner, you'll notice that every corner you go to in Belfast is rounded. If you have a look at this one, it must be about the original surviving corner that there is in Belfast. That's another wee fact that people don't realise. Now, if anybody can spot another one, let me know. Rebel Hill, this street here, the original name of it was Grattan Street. And in this block here, from Grattan Street till Hill Street, just a small area, was one of the most notorious slums. And someone was talking to me earlier on about O'Halloran's book. O'Halloran was a minister in Donegall Street Congregational Church, and he came and done tours around these areas, and the stuff that he discovered was horrifying. You know, the way people were living was just horrific. In this area here, this small tiny area, there was over 3,000 people living. You know, so try and imagine what that must have been like. As I mentioned, you'd no water get into the houses, but there was a water supply. There was one water tap for every 2 courts. There was one toilet beside the water tap. Now, don't be thinking about water tap the way it is today, or even toilets the way they are today, because they weren't. What you had was the water tap was taken from a well, and what it would have been with the old pumps. It would have been taken from a well down below. The toilet, which was beside it, the water ran into the well down below. So for that reason, people tended not to use them. And one of the more prominent things about Victorian or pre-Victorian Belfast was that they brought water around in barrels and sold it, but it was clean water. You know, so to have a well pumping up water and having a toilet putting the water back in, it just didn't make sense. Even in those days, it didn't make sense. But the people who built these areas just didn't care. All they wanted was their money. That was all. And they crammed as many people as they could into these areas, into these slums. And whenever it came to the mid-1840s, you know, things were to have tragic consequences. The first we had was, you know, fever. And fever simply wiped out thousands of people. Now, fever, as we know, is just that feeling of cold sweat, warm sweat, stuff like that. It actually has a better name today, and it's flu. If you caught the flu in those days, see you were dead. It was as simple as that. And if you look at how many times each of us have caught the flu, try to imagine what the death rate must have been like. So whenever it came to the mid-1840s, it just got 10 times worse, because what we had in Ireland was the famine, and people were flocking into these towns and being compressed into these areas. So if one person in a household, now in a house, bear in mind there was something up to 4 or 5 families living in one house, but if one person caught that flu, the whole house caught it. Once the whole house caught it, the whole court caught it. Once the whole court caught it, the whole area caught it. And that's how horrible it was. If you imagine, whenever it came to being buried, we have these images of the old plague things, you know, bring out the dead, people going around with carts. That's exactly what it was like. When people died, they were simply thrown out onto the streets, and people went around and picked up the bodies. Perfect time to get rid of a wife, you know, but that's what the way it was. And it was more out of desperation as what it was of anything else. Now, the next thing that then happened was the fever then developed into something far worse, and that was cholera. Cholera is the Greek word for diarrhea. So you try and imagine what these people, their deaths must have been like. Your body couldn't hold water. The more water you drunk, well, I was going to say the worse you would have made it, but you're going to die. But the more horrific and more painful your death would have been. Your body just simply couldn't hold water, and that water came out of every opening in your body, right from your eyes, right down. And they were horrible, slow, painful deaths. So in Belfast, at that time, it is estimated that up to 40,000 people died as a result of fever, cholera, and dysentery. And that started 1845 and ended in 1848. You know, and people just didn't care. You know, they were only poor people, they were only common people. But as saying, back to O'Halloran, O'Halloran went round these areas and described what the living conditions were like. And to give you an idea of what the trying to bury these people was like, I'll give you a quote from the Belfast newsletter. And it was a reporter who went to Clifton Street Cemetery on the 9th of July 1847, and he described what he saw. In the course of the present week, we saw no fewer than 20 coffins containing the corpses of persons who had died of fever in the various hospitals in town during the preceding 24 hours. They were lying for interment in that portion of a new burying ground for that purpose, while cartloads would arrive before the common grave was ready for the reception. So basically what was happening is the hospitals were putting up, it's an insult to call them coffins, they were just boxes with about 5 people in them. So the hospitals are setting them up, and the people are going around with carts. Their grave diggers just couldn't cope, so the people were just lying for something up to 3-4 weeks before they could be buried. To move back to the area, as I said, O'Halloran was the minister of Donegall Street Congregational Church, which is just a couple of doors down from the Irish News. And he went around, and I'm going to describe what he had written. Now, bear in mind, he had went round this area and written this at the time. So I'll just give you an idea of what the sort of stuff was he was writing. And the area in question is this area, Grattan Court, which stood just roughly where the end gates are, just here. Here my companion and myself picked upon 2 houses as specimens of the whole. In one of these we found that 7 persons live and sleep in the same room. Their beds, if such they may be called, lying upon the floor. The desolation and wretchedness of this apartment, apartment now is something for 150 grand, isn't it? The wretchedness of this apartment without windows and open in all directions is utterly impossible to describe. 4 of the persons huddled together thus are females, the other 3 males. And among these females, 2, a mother and her grown-up daughter, have no affinity with the other inmates. So in other words, they weren't related. In the other house in the same row, we discovered that a family of 7 sleep not only in the same room, but on the same bed. This information we had from the poor half-naked mother herself. Here the eldest daughter is 19 years of age and the eldest son is 12. The revolting, disgusting and heart-rending spectacle presented by the interior of this hovel and by its inmates is impossible to forget. It haunts one like a loathsome and odious spectre from which the eye and the thoughts cannot escape. We entered Johnny's entry, which lies just off Talbot Street, and here we found some degrading and demoralising practice prevailing. I think he's going to work out what that is. In the very first house we visited in the place, the husband, wife and 6 children all sleep together, the eldest son being 14 and the eldest daughter being 12 years of age. Morrow's entry runs between Hill Street and Grattan Street, and here also, the very first house we entered, we learnt that the father, the mother is dead, and all his children occupied by one sleeping apartment, the eldest daughter being 26 and another daughter 17 years of age. He's describing exactly what he's seen, and he must have been here, 10 minutes. And that gives, I hope it explains exactly what the living conditions were. But as I mentioned about just this block, 3,000 people crammed in. And whenever you are passing, if you look just over, the modern buildings is Hill Street running down. So it'll give you that idea of just how tight and compact the whole area is. So we're going to move down now towards the Parliament, which I've never been in my life, and up the street.